Welcome to Sleep Nostalgia. Today, I'll be reading a rendition of Snow White, a classic fairy tale of a young princess with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. Snow White, who is kind and beautiful, is forced into hiding by her jealous stepmother, the evil queen. Deep in a dark forest, she comes across a charming cottage. This is the home of 7 kind dwarfs who invite Snow White to stay. But the evil queen will stop at nothing to be crowned fairest in all the land. I hope the story and soft music relaxes you into a deep, pleasant sleep. But first, we'll take a moment to calm and center ourselves with some simple relaxation techniques. I invite you to take a deep breath. Hold that breath for a moment. Now, slowly let it out. Good, and take another deep breath in. Imagine you're drawing air in from your lungs all the way down to your feet. As each breath moves through you, I want you to pay attention to any areas of tension in your body. With each breath, I want you to slowly let your muscles relax and release any tension you may be carrying. Take a deep breath in and slowly release that breath. Another breath in and another breath out. Breathe in. Breathe out. In and out. As you listen to the story, let your body and mind slip deeper and deeper into relaxation. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window, sewing. The frame of the window was made of black ebony. Whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. She looked at the red upon the white snow, and thought to herself, if only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame. Soon after, she had a little daughter, whose skin was as white as snow, with lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony. She was called Little Snow White. But when the child was born, the queen died. The king remarried the next year. His new wife was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty. She could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had an enchanted looking glass, and would often stand before it, saying, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the looking glass would answer, "Thou, O Queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. As time passed, little Snow White grew more and more beautiful. When she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and already more beautiful than the queen herself. One day, when the queen asked her enchanted looking glass, "Who is fairest in all the land?" it answered her, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White I deem." Then the queen was shocked and turned green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at little Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the maiden so. As the years passed, the queen's bitterness grew like a weed in her heart. By the time Snow White came of age, the queen had no peace either day or night, so strong was her envy. One day, the old king died. Then the queen said to herself, "I can no longer bear to have Snow White in my sight." So she called forth a huntsman and commanded him to take Snow White away into the forest and kill her. The huntsman obeyed the queen's wicked order and took Snow White away. But when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, "Dear huntsman, leave me my life. If you do, I'll run away into the wild forest and never come home again. The queen will never know you spared me." The huntsman had pity on her and said, "Go then to the forest." As she left, he thought to himself, "The wild beasts will soon have devoured the girl, and the queen's bidding will be done." And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer he who would kill her. Snow White ran terrified through the great forest. She ran over sharp stones, through thorns, and past wild beasts, but none harmed her. When it felt as if her feet could not take a single step more, she came across a little cottage and went into it to rest. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table with 7 plates made up with food, 7 neatly laid sets of utensils, and 7 mugs filled with wine. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side, covered with smartly tucked sheets. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate and drank a drop of wine out of each mug. For she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds. But none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short. But at last she found that the 7th one was right. So she remained in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs who mined deep in the mountains for ore. To their surprise, they found that their home was not in the same order in which they had left it. One said, "Who has been sitting on my chair?" A second, "Who has been eating my supper?" Another exclaimed, "Who has been drinking wine from my mug?" Then another looked round and saw that his smartly tucked sheets were crumpled, and huffed, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up and each called out, "Somebody has crumpled my sheets too." But when the seventh looked at his bed, he saw Snow White lying fast asleep therein. He called the others, who came running up, and they gasped with astonishment, and brought their 7 candles, and let the light fall on Snow White. They whispered to one another, "What a lovely girl, she looks like she's come a long way." So they left her to sleep, and the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so Snow White passed her first night in the dwarf's cottage. The next morning, Snow White awoke to find the 7 friendly dwarfs. She told them how the wicked queen had wished to have her killed, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run for the whole day, until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarfs said, "If you will help take care of our house, you are welcome to stay with us. If you stay, you shall want for nothing." Snow White happily agreed, relieved to have found a new home. Each day the dwarfs went to the mountains, while Snow White kept the house, and passed her days enjoying the forest. When the dwarfs came back in the evenings, hot supper was ready and waiting. In this manner, Snow White and the dwarfs spent many happy days together. Each day, before the dwarfs left, they warned her, "Beware of the queen. She will soon know that you are here, so be sure to let no one in." But the queen, believing that Snow White was dead, could not but think that she herself was again the first and most beautiful of all. She went to her looking glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "My queen, thou art fairest of all I see. But over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, lovely Snow White is alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, for Snow White was still alive. And so the evil queen thought and thought again how she might kill Snow White. Envy would let her have no rest until she herself was the fairest in the whole land. At last she thought of something to do. The queen painted her face, dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and made her way to the dwarf's home. The disguised queen knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap." Snow White looked out the window and called, "Hello, dear woman, what have you to sell today?" "Good things, pretty things, and laces of all colors," and the wicked queen pulled out one which was woven of bright-colored silk. "Surely, this is a worthy old woman," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly." Snow White had no suspicion and let herself be laced. But the old woman laced so quickly and laced so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Finally, I am the most beautiful." And the wicked queen returned to her castle. Not long after, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home. How shocked they were to find their dear Snow White lying on the ground. She did not stir or move and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and when they saw that she was laced too tightly, quickly cut the laces. Then Snow White began to breathe, and after a while came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was surely the wicked queen in disguise. Take care and let no one come into the home when you are alone." When the evil queen reached the castle, she gleefully stood in front of the enchanted glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" It answered as before, "My queen, thou art fairest of all I see. But over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, lovely Snow White is alive and well, and none is so fair as she." All the wicked queen's blood rushed to her heart with rage, for she saw plainly that Snow White was again alive. Desperate to put an end to her rival, she used her witchcraft to make a poisonous comb. The evil queen disguised herself as another old woman. When she arrived at the home, she called out, "Hello, hello, I have good things to sell." Snow White looked out in dismay and said, "You must go away, I cannot let anyone come in." Then the crafty old woman replied, "I can show you my wares from here." She pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the maiden so well that she let herself be beguiled and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now let me comb your beautiful ebony hair properly." Poor Snow White had no suspicion and let the old woman do as she pleased. But hardly had she put the comb in her hair that the poison in it took effect, and the maiden fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "at last you are done." And she went away celebrating. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the queen. They looked and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. At home, the queen once again questioned her enchanted glass, but it answered as before, "My queen, thou art fairest of all I see. But over the hills, where the 7 dwarfs dwell, lovely Snow White is alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled with bitter hatred. She resolved to kill Snow White, even at the cost of her life. She went into a secret, lonely room where no one ever came and made a poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it. But whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself as a country woman and made her way to Snow White. Again, the disguised queen knocked at Snow White's door. Snow White called out from the window, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs forbade it." The woman answered, "Not even for the sweetest apple? Here, child, I will give you one to taste." But when Snow White refused, the crooked old woman smiled and said, "Are you afraid of poison? I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple. When she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer. She stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But as soon as she bit into it, Snow White fell down dead. The queen cackled dreadfully as she proclaimed, "Snow White will never rise again." The wicked queen returned to her looking glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, "Who in this land is the fairest of all?" At last the glass answered, "My queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." And the jealous fire in her bitter heart quieted. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found little Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was all of no use. The poor child was dead. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat round it and wept for her. They wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she was living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground," and they made a transparent coffin of glass, so that she might be seen from all sides. They laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and wrote that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain. One of them always stayed by it to watch it. Birds came too, and wept for little Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin. She did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she remained as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest. He saw the coffin on the mountain, and beautiful Snow White within it. He read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him and gave him the coffin. So the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders. It happened that they stumbled over a tree stump. With the shock, the poisonous piece of apple, which Snow White had bitten off, came out of her throat. And before long she opened her eyes and was once more alive. "Where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You are with me," and told her what had happened, and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife." And little Snow White was willing and went with him. Their wedding was held with great show and splendor. And little Snow White lived happily ever after. I hope today's session helped you to drift into a peaceful rest. Before we go, let's enjoy one more calm moment together. Take a deep breath in and slowly release that breath. Another breath in and another breath out. Breathe in. Breathe out. In and out. That's our session for today. As the music continues to play, keep taking deep, relaxing breaths. I hope we see each other again soon. Until then, have a good rest.